In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arizona Territory, where the only sounds were often the cry of a hawk or the crack of a rifle, the most dangerous threats were the ones that came in silence. They crept in not with the thunder of hooves, but on the back of a whisper, a fever, a secret carried on the wind. This is the story of Din, a quiet Navajo girl whom everyone saw but no one truly noticed. It's a story about how her silent observation of a single drop of sweat on a boy's brow would unravel a conspiracy of pride, challenge the bedrock of her tribe's tradition, and force a powerful chief to make an impossible choice before the sun came up. What she found was a fever of a different kind, one that could burn down his legacy or be the spark that saved it all. The sun over the Dine lands was a merciless molten coin, bleaching the life from anything that couldn't find shadow. It baked the crimson earth into a cracked mosaic and beat down upon the scattered hogans of Chief Hashke's people, making the very air shimmer with heat. Inside this furnace of life, Din moved like a whisper. At 16, she was a creature of the periphery, her silence often mistaken for simplicity, her gaze for vacancy. Her parents had been taken by the coughing sickness years ago, leaving her in the care of an aunt who had little time for a girl who preferred the company of medicinal herbs and the quiet language of the land over the chatter of the other women at the looms. Dene's grandmother, a formidable healer, whose memory was now a revered but distant legend, had been her true teacher. "The world speaks, little one," she used to say, her fingers crushing sage until its pungent soul filled the air. Most listen to the thunder. They hear the coyotes cry and the warriors shout. But the real stories are in the silence, the way a leaf curls before a drought, the way a man's eyes shift before he tells a lie, the color of sickness on his skin before the fever even has a name. Dinah had taken the lesson to heart. She saw the world in layers of detail others missed. Today the tribe was celebrating. Nalnish, the chief's only son and the blazing heart of their future, had returned from his first solo hunt in the Chuska Mountains. At 14 he was already strong, his shoulders broadening his laughter, a confident rolling sound that echoed through the small encampment. He brought back a magnificent buck, and the tribe feasted its collective pride centered on this boy who was the embodiment of their strength and continuation. Chief Hashke, a man whose face was a roadmap of battles fought and dignities defended, watched his son with an uncharacteristic softness in his eyes. He stood tall and unyielding, a leader forged in conflict with both the U.S. Army and rival tribes, but his love for Naalnish was his one unguarded flank. Beside him, radiating an aura of self-importance, was Hastin, the tribe's medicine man. Hastin was a man of ceremony and spectacle. His chants were loud, his rattles shook with authority, and his remedies were steeped in ancient rituals that were more about placating spirits than mending flesh. He dealt in the grand and the mystical, and had little patience for the subtle, earth-bound cures Dene's grandmother had practiced. As the celebration reached its peak, warriors recounted tales of their own first hunts, their voices booming. Nalnish, sitting by the fire, was retelling his story, his hands animatedly describing the buck's path. The firelight danced across his face, and to everyone else, he was the picture of robust health. But Dane, sitting far back in the shadows, saw something else. It was a slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a piece of roasted meat. It was the unnatural sheen of sweat on his brow, too slick and oily for the dry evening heat. When he stood, he swayed for a fraction of a second, a minute loss of balance so fleeting that only someone watching for it could have caught it. Her heart gave a small, tight squeeze of unease. She had seen that look before in the eyes of sheep just before they sickened, a bright glassy fire that mimicked life but heralded its decline. Later, as the festivities wound down and the first stars pricked the indigo velvet of the sky, Nalnish was challenged to a foot race by another boy. He accepted with his usual boisterous grin. They ran a blur of motion against the dusky landscape. Nalnish won as he always did, but as he slowed to a stop, clutching his side and panting, Dane saw it again, clearer this time. The flush on his cheeks wasn't the healthy red of exertion. It was a blotchy, angry crimson, a color that seemed painted on rather than rising from within. It was the color of a lie, the lie his body was telling everyone, pretending to be strong when a hidden fire was just beginning to smolder. She looked towards Hastine, who was watching the boys with a patronizing smile. He saw a victorious young warrior. He didn't see the slight stumble, the glassy eyes, or the false color blooming on the boy's skin. He was listening for thunder, and Dean was hearing the first faint crackle of a flame. That night, as she lay in her small, lonely corner of her aunt's hogan, the image of that unnatural flush haunted her. It was a secret only she knew, a terrible weight in the profound silence of the desert night. The chief's son was sick, and no one else had any idea. 2 days passed. The vibrant memory of the celebration faded under the relentless sun, replaced by a creeping, anxious hush. The confident laughter of Nalnish no longer echoed through the camp. He had taken to his sleeping mat inside the chief's spacious hogan, complaining of a headache and aching bones. At first, Chief Hashke dismissed it as the boy's exhaustion from the hunt. But by the third morning, the truth could no longer be ignored. The boy was burning. A palpable fear, cold and sharp despite the heat, began to snake its way through the community. Nalnish was not just a boy. He was a symbol. His health was the tribe's health. His future, their future. Hastine was summoned. He swept into the chief's hogan with a flourish of his feathered staff and a bag of sacred corn pollen, his face a mask of solemn authority. Danon, like many others, lingered outside, a silent observer in a growing crowd of worried faces. They couldn't see inside, but they could hear. Hastine's voice, a low and theatrical chant, rose and fell. The dry, rhythmic hiss of his gourd rattle was the only other sound, a serpent's warning in the still air. An hour passed. Then 2. Finally, the medicine man emerged, his expression grim and profound. He let the silence hang, ensuring all eyes were on him before he spoke. "This is no common sickness," he announced, his voice carrying across the unnaturally quiet clearing. "The boy's spirit is under attack. A curse has been laid upon him." A collective gasp went through the crowd. A curse was a thing of terrifying power, a malevolent arrow shot from the spirit world. It was a sickness of the soul far beyond the reach of simple herbs. "It is the work of an enemy." Hastine continued, his eyes scanning the horizon, as if seeking a distant foe. "Someone who envies the strength of our chief and the promise of his son. The boy's fire is not of the body. It is a spirit fire meant to consume him from within. We must perform the blessing way chant. We must gather the sacred items. This is a battle of wills of spirit, not of flesh." Chief Hashke appeared in the doorway of the hogan, his face etched with a pain that seemed to have aged him a decade in a single morning. He nodded his assent to Hastine's diagnosis. The pronouncement settled over the camp like a shroud. The enemy was invisible, the illness intangible. Their fate now rested on Hastine's ability to navigate the treacherous currents of the spirit world. Dane felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with curses. She had crept closer than most, close enough to the hogan's entrance to catch a glimpse of the boy when a woman entered with a water skin. She saw Nalnish, tossing on his pallet, his skin now glistening with a fever so intense it was visible. And she saw something else on his chest and neck, a faint sandpaper-like rash, a scattering of tiny red pinpricks, the same angry color she had seen on his cheeks. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, as clear as if she were standing beside her. The settlers bring sicknesses that wear strange masks. They can look like the touch of a spirit, but they are born of bad water and tainted air. Do not be fooled by the mask, little one. Look at the skin. The skin tells the truth. This was not a spirit fire. This was a blood fire, a poison racing through his veins. She knew it with a certainty that made her tremble. Hastine, in his arrogance, was fighting the wrong enemy. He was chanting at shadows, while a tangible wolf was devouring the boy from the inside out. She had to say something. Mustering every ounce of her courage, she approached an elder woman, Kay, who was known for her kindness. "Grandmother," Dean whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "The boy, I have seen a rash, like the one my grandmother described, from the settlers." Ken looked down at her, her expression a mixture of pity and impatience. "Hush, child. This is a matter for the medicine man, not for girls who play with weeds. Hastine has spoken. It is a curse." She turned away, dismissing Danae as if she were a buzzing fly. The rejection stung, but it was the fear that truly galvanized her. Every hour they wasted on chants and ceremonies was an hour the fever tightened its grip on Nalnish. She watched as Hastine began his elaborate preparations, directing men to find a flawless eagle feather and women to grind sacred corn. It was all a grand, useless performance, a lie they were telling themselves to feel in control of something they didn't understand. That evening, Dane slipped away from the camp. She walked towards the low-lying creek bed, her eyes scanning the ground, not for spirits, but for the familiar, humble shapes of her grandmother's remedies. She found a cluster of willow trees, their leaves shimmering silver in the twilight. She stripped away sections of the bark, her fingers sure and practiced. Willow bark, the fever breaker. She found yarrow, the plant that makes the body sweat out its poisons. These were not sacred items. They were simple, powerful truths growing from the earth. As she worked, she could hear the faint, monotonous drone of Hastine's chant beginning its long nightly vigil. It sounded to her now not like a song of healing, but a dirge, a song of a lie that was leading the chief's son and the hope of her people deeper into the dark. She held the rough bark in her hands, its earthy scent, a connection to the real world of flesh and blood, of life and death. Hastine could have his spirits. She would put her faith in the earth. The night was long and suffocating. Hastine's chant became the heartbeat of the camp's anxiety, a continuous mournful hum that offered no comfort, only a reminder of the unseen battle being waged within the chief's hogan. For 2 days the medicine man performed his rites. He drew intricate patterns in the sand-burned sacred juniper and recited the ancient stories of creation, all to fortify the boy's spirit against the alleged curse. But the fever did not listen to stories. Nalnish grew worse. The reports that trickled out were grim. He was delirious, crying out for water one moment and thrashing against invisible demons the next. The angry red rash had spread a damning testament to the fire raging within him. The optimism that Hastine had initially inspired was curdling into a thick, silent despair. The people watched the chief's hogan as if it were a tomb in the making. Dean could not sleep. She sat with her small bundle of willow bark and yarrow, the scent a constant, desperate reminder of the real medicine that was being ignored. She watched the comings and goings, her mind a whirlwind of her grandmother's teachings. Courage, little one, is not the absence of fear. It is seeing the truth and choosing to speak it even when your voice shakes. Her voice always shook. But the image of Nalnish fading away while his people put their faith in a lie was a torment she could no longer bear in silence. She had to try again, not with a whisper to a dismissive elder, but with the full force of her conviction. On the third night, a new crisis erupted. A woman came running from the chief's dwelling, her face pale with terror. "He cannot breathe. His throat is closing." That was the final spur. Dean knew this symptom. It was part of the sickness her grandmother had called the strangling fire, a disease she had seen wipe out a settler's family near Fort Defiance years ago. It was swift and merciless. Chance would not open a swollen throat. With her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, Danae walked out of the shadows and directly towards the chief's hogan. She clutched her small leather pouch of herbs so tightly her knuckles were white. The two warriors guarding the entrance men who had known her as a quiet slip of a girl, her whole life moved to block her path. "No one is to enter." One of them said, his voice firm, but his eyes filled with the same fear as everyone else's. "Hestine is with the boy." "Hestine is wrong," Dina said. The words came out stronger than she expected, clear and sharp in the tense silence. "The sickness is in his blood, not his spirit. I have medicine that will help him breathe." The guard stared at her, astonished by her audacity. Before he could respond, Hastine himself emerged from the hogan, his face slick with sweat, and his ceremonial paint smudged. His eyes, when they fell on Dean, were filled with a venomous fury. "You!" He spat his voice a low hiss. "The weed-gatherer's granddaughter, spreading whispers and doubt. Go back to your shadows. You are meddling with powers you cannot comprehend." "The power I comprehend is the one that is killing him." Dean shot back, her fear momentarily burned away by a desperate anger. "It is a settler's sickness. The rash, the fever, the swelling in his throat, these are the signs. Your chants are fanning the flames, not quenching them." Her direct challenge was a shocking breach of custom. To openly defy the medicine man, and at the chief's doorstep, was unthinkable. A murmur of disbelief and outrage rippled through the onlookers who had gathered nearby. Hastine's face darkened with rage. He took a step towards her, his hand raised. "You will be silent. You speak sacrilege. You dishonor your ancestors and our traditions with your child's arrogance." It was at that moment that the flap of the hogan was thrust aside, and Chief Hashki appeared. He looked like a mountain crumbling from within. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements heavy with exhaustion and grief. He had heard the confrontation. He looked from Hastine's incandescent fury to Dina's small, determined frame. "What is the meaning of this?" He demanded, his voice a low rumble of authority, though it was frayed with despair. "Chief," Hastine said, turning to him with an air of wounded dignity, "this girl mocks the sacred rites. She claims the wisdom of her grandmother, a woman who often chose roots over faith. She offers you dirt and leaves, while I wrestle with the dark spirits that have claimed your son." Hashki's gaze settled on Dean. It was a heavy, piercing look, searching for any hint of deceit or foolishness. Most people withered under that gaze. Dane met it head-on. She did not lower her eyes. "Chief Hashka," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "My grandmother taught me that faith is good, but truth is essential. The truth is that your son is being consumed by a fire that willow bark can cool. His throat is closing from a swelling that a poultice of—" She swallowed, remembering the name Mullin Root can soothe. "I saw the sickness on him days ago. This is not a curse, it is a disease, and it has a cure." She held out her pouch. In the flickering firelight, it looked impossibly small and insignificant, a handful of dried plants, against the vast, terrifying power of a deadly curse. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Dean had not just offered medicine. She had thrown down a gauntlet. She had challenged their traditions, their medicine man, and their understanding of the world. Now the chief, a man trapped between the ancient ways and the terrifying prospect of his son's death, had to make a choice. The weight of her whisper hung in the air heavier than any scream. The silence that followed Danin's words was absolute. It was a void filled with the unspoken weight of tradition, the raw fear of death, and the shocking audacity of a girl who should have been invisible. Chief Hashki's eyes remained locked on her, and in their depths a storm of conflict raged. To his right stood Hastin, the embodiment of generations of spiritual authority, his face a thundercloud of indignation. To his left stood Dean, an orphan, with nothing but a pouch of herbs and a desperate, unwavering certainty in her eyes. Hastin broke the silence. "Chief, you cannot entertain this folly. It is an insult. She offers you common weeds against a supernatural evil. If you allow her to proceed, you invalidate our ways. You invite dishonor upon us all. The spirits will see it as a betrayal." Every word was a hammer blow, meant to reinforce the walls of dogma. But something in Dina's stance, in the quiet fire of her conviction, had pierced the chief's armor of grief. He was a practical man, a leader who had survived by reading the shifting winds and the subtle tracks in the dust. He had survived by recognizing truth, even when it came in an unwelcome form. He thought of Dane's grandmother, Shandien. She had been a healer of uncanny skill. He remembered a time when a strange lung sickness had swept through the camp, and Hastin had declared it the work of vengeful wind spirits. He had prescribed days of chanting while people coughed their lives away. Shandien, defying him, had brewed a bitter tea from a pungent root and forced it down the throats of the sick. Many who drank it had lived. Hastin had called it a coincidence. Hashki had never been so sure. Now he looked at Dane, and for the first time he saw not a child, but the ghost of the grandmother, her same stubborn practicality shining in the girl's dark eyes. His son was dying. Hastin's rituals had failed. The boy's breathing was a ragged, shallow scrape. What was the greater folly, to cling to a failing tradition or to gamble on a sliver of earthly hope? His decision when it came was like the crack of a breaking stone. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. He turned not to Hastin but to Dean. "You say you can help him breathe? You say you can cool the fire?" "I can try," Dean said, her voice soft but firm. "The medicine is from the earth. It is honest." Hashki's jaw tightened. He looked at the sky, at the scattering of stars that seemed cold and indifferent. The moon was a pale sliver offering little light. It was the last hour of the deepest night, the hour when spirits were strongest, and when life was at its most fragile. "Hastin," the chief said, finally turning to the medicine man, "you have done all you can. Your chants have battled the spirits. Now you will step aside." The collective shock of the crowd was a physical force. Hastin looked as if he had been struck. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Pride, fury, and disbelief warred on his face. Hashki ignored him. His focus was entirely on Dean. He made a pact, not with the spirits, but with her. "You will have until the first light of dawn," he declared, his voice ringing with the finality of a death sentence or a pardon. "You may use your grandmother's ways, but hear my words. If my son's condition worsens, if the dawn comes and his spirit has fled, your life will answer for the false hope you have given me this night." The threat was stark and brutal. Dane's breath caught in her throat. She was not just being given a chance, she was being placed on a sacrificial altar. Her failure would not be met with dismissal, but with death. The warriors at the door tensed their hands, resting on their knives. They were no longer guards. They were her potential executioners. For a heartbeat, that terror seized her. She was a girl, not a miracle worker. What if she was wrong? What if the herbs failed? But then she saw the image of Nalnish gasping for air, his body consumed by a fire she knew she could fight. Her fear for him was greater than the fear for herself. She lifted her chin and met the chief's hard gaze. "I accept," she whispered. Chief Hashki nodded, once a sharp, grim gesture. He motioned for the guards to let her pass. As Dean walked towards the entrance of the Hogan, the crowd parted for her as if she were a ghost. She could feel Hastine's hateful glare burning into her back. He had not moved, a statue of rage and humiliation. Stepping into the dim, heavy air of the chief's Hogan was like entering another world. The air was thick with the smell of sickness, juniper smoke, and fear. Nalnish lay on a pile of furs, his body twitching in the throes of a violent fever. His mother, a woman named Hodzo, knelt beside him, weeping silently as she wiped his brow with a damp cloth. She looked up at Dina with eyes full of suspicion and desperation. Dina didn't hesitate. The wager had been made. The race against the dawn had begun. She knelt beside the boy, opened her pouch, and began the work that would either save 2 lives or end them both. Inside the Hogan, the only light came from a single, low-burning tallow lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the curved walls. The world outside, with its judgment and its politics, ceased to exist. There was only the boy, the fire consuming him, and the dwindling hours of the night. Nalnish was worse than she had imagined. His breath was a terrifying, high-pitched stridor. With each inhalation, the sound of air struggling to pass through a closing passage. His skin was scorching to the touch, and the rash now covered his entire torso. Hodzo, his mother, watched Dean with the eyes of a cornered animal, ready to defend her cub against this strange girl who had been granted this desperate last-ditch effort. "Give me the water skin," Dean said softly, her voice calm and authoritative, in a way that surprised even herself. "And build up the fire. I need boiling water." Hodzo, accustomed to taking orders only from her husband or Hastine, hesitated for a moment. But the quiet command in Dine's voice, devoid of Hastine's dramatic flair, yet filled with purpose, moved her to obey. Dine's hands worked with a deftness born of years of practice. She took a flat stone and began to crush the dried willow bark into a coarse powder. As Hodzo coaxed the embers in the central fire pit back to life, Dean prepared her remedies. The ground willow bark went into a small clay pot with water to be set near the flames, its bitter, fever-reducing properties waiting to be released. Her next task was more urgent, the boy's breathing. She took out the gnarled mullein root and began to shave it into fine slivers with her knife. Then she crushed fresh yarrow leaves, mixing them with the mullein and a bit of tallow to create a thick, pungent poultice. "We must put this on his chest and throat," she told Hodzo. The chief's wife flinched. Hastine said nothing should touch his skin, that it would trap the spirit fire. "The fire is in his blood, not on his skin," Dane countered gently but firmly. "This will help open his lungs and ease the swelling. Please, we do not have much time." Seeing the logic in Dane's actions, Hodzo nodded and helped her pull back the boy's buckskin shirt. The heat radiating from his chest was shocking. Together, they carefully spread the warm, sticky poultice over his throat and chest. The herbal scent, sharp and clean, began to fill the hogan, cutting through the stale odor of sickness. While the poultice did its work, Dean's eyes were constantly scanning the boy, observing every detail. It was then, as she adjusted the furs beneath his legs, that she saw it. On the back of his calf, hidden in the faint shadows, was a small dark scab, surrounded by a circle of inflamed red skin. It was no bigger than her thumbnail. It wasn't a rash. It was a bite. Her mind raced, sifting through her grandmother's lessons. Some fevers are not passed from man to man, but are delivered by the smallest of messengers. The tick, the fly, the mosquito. They carry a poison in their bite that can burn like the sun. This was it. The missing piece. Mountain fever. The kind carried by the wood ticks in the high country, like the Chuska Mountains where Nalnish had been hunting. It explained everything, the sudden onset, the intense fever, the aches and the rash. It was a sickness of the blood, introduced by a tiny, almost invisible source. Hustin, looking for a grand spiritual curse, had never even thought to look for something so small and mundane. The discovery solidified her resolve. She wasn't just guessing anymore. She knew her enemy. The willow bark tea was now steeping a dark, bitter brew. Getting Nalnish to drink was the next challenge. He was barely conscious, locked in his delirium. "Hold his head up," Dene instructed Hozho. Dene dipped the edge of a clean cloth into the tea and gently squeezed a few drops into the boy's mouth. At first he choked, but some of the liquid went down. They continued, drop by drop, a painfully slow process. It was a battle for every single swallow. They worked in silence, two women from opposite ends of the tribe's social strata, now united in a single, desperate purpose. Hours crawled by. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the boy's labored breathing, and the soft instructions from Dan. She worked tirelessly, reapplying cool, damp cloths to his forehead, coaxing more of the bitter tea past his lips and checking the poultice. She spoke to him not with chants, but with soft, encouraging words. "Fight the fire, Nalnish. Your body is strong. Help the medicine. Fight." Outside, she could feel the presence of the others, the chief standing vigil, Hastin lurking like a vulture, waiting for her to fail. The entire camp suspended, in a state of fearful anticipation. Their collective doubt and hope was a palpable pressure against the Hogan's walls. As the sky outside began to pale from black to a deep, bruised purple, a change occurred. The boy's breathing, which had been a ragged, painful rasp, began to deepen. The terrible high-pitched stridor softened, becoming a less constricted, though still labored, sound. It was a small change, almost imperceptible, but to Dean it was like the first crack in a dam. She placed her hand on his forehead. The skin was still hot, dangerously so, but the violent searing heat had lessened. It was no longer like touching a hot stone. A thin film of sweat had broken out on his skin, a true sweat, the body's own attempt to cool itself, prompted by the yarrow and willow. The medicine was working. The earth was fighting back. Dean felt a wave of exhaustion, so profound it almost buckled her. She had been awake for days, running on nothing but fear and focus. But she couldn't rest. The dawn was coming. The chief's pact was nearly due. The boy was better. But was he better enough? The edge of the world began to bleed. At first it was a faint, bruised purple seeping into the obsidian blackness of the sky, a subtle dilution of the night's absolute authority. Then a line of pale, ghostly grey appeared, outlining the sharp silhouette of the distant mesas. The stars, which had seemed so permanent and pitiless all night, began to fade, retreating like a vanquished army. The air grew colder, carrying a clean, sharp scent of dust and juniper, a final exhalation of the night before the sun's arrival. This was the hour of judgment, when the world held its breath, waiting to see what the darkness had taken and what it had left behind. For the people of the camp, huddled in their blankets and watching from the edges of the central clearing, this dawn was more than just the start of a new day. It was a verdict. Their forms were dark and indistinct, a silent congregation awaiting a pronouncement that would either restore their future or condemn them to a winter of grief. They had spent the night caught in a terrible limbo, suspended between the ancient thundering authority of Hastin and the desperate whispered promise of an orphan girl. A solemn procession, a stark tableau of power and consequence, broke from the crowd and moved toward the chief's hogan. Hashke led the way. His face, carved by years of war and leadership, was an unreadable mask of stone, but the stillness of his features was a lie. Inside, a maelstrom of agony was raging. Every step was a monumental effort of will, a march toward a truth he was not sure he could bear. His mind was a chaotic prayer, a desperate bargain with any spirit that might listen, alternating with the cold, brutal preparation for giving the order that would end the quiet girl's life. He was not just a chief enforcing a pact. He was a father, walking toward the final answer in his son's battle for life, and the weight of that duality threatened to crush him. Behind him, walking with a self-assured, almost theatrical solemnity, was Hastin. The medicine man's expression was a carefully crafted blend of grim concern and profound wisdom, but beneath it a triumphant, malevolent sneer was waiting to break free. He was certain of what they would find. He could already feel the words of his vindication forming on his tongue. He would speak of the girl's hubris, of the danger of abandoning the sacred ways for childish remedies. He would describe the purification rituals needed to cleanse the chief's hogan of her contaminating influence. This, he told himself, was a necessary, if tragic, lesson that would reaffirm his own power and steer his people back from the precipice of foolishness. Flanking them were the two warriors who had guarded the door. Their faces were grim, their hands resting on their knives. Their duty, which had been to keep people out, had now shifted to a far more terrible purpose. They were no longer sentries. They were potential executioners, the instruments of the chief's brutal pact. The flap of the hogan was pulled back, and the chief paused for a heartbeat at the threshold before stepping inside. The first weak rays of the nascent sun followed him, timidly probing the dim interior. The light illuminated a scene of profound exhaustion. Dane was kneeling beside Nalnish's pallet, her small frame slumped with a weariness that seemed to have settled into her very bones. Her face was pale and smudged with soot, her eyes huge and dark in the wan light. Hozho, the boy's mother, was asleep, her body slumped in a posture of utter defeat, her head resting on the edge of her son's furs, her hand still clutching his limp one. The air was thick and heavy, a complex tapestry of smells. The bitter tang of boiled willow bark, the sharp scent of the mullein poultice, the cloying odor of sickness, and the raw animal smell of fear. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Nalnish lay unnervingly still, his eyes closed. From the doorway he looked no different than he had the night before, a body ravaged by an unstoppable fire. A low, almost inaudible moan escaped the boy's lips, a sound of such deep suffering that it seemed to confirm the worst. Hastin's smirk finally broke through his mask of solemnity. He stepped confidently into the hogan, his shadow falling long and dark across the floor. "It is as I feared, Chief," he began, his voice a smooth, sorrowful balm that was meant to sound like sympathy, but dripped with self-satisfaction. "The spirit fire has consumed him. The curse has completed its work. You can see the vessel is broken." He gestured toward the boy. "This girl's peasant tricks have done nothing but disturb his final journey and profane this space. She has prolonged his suffering and given you a cruel and empty hope." But Dene wasn't listening to Hastin. Her gaze was locked on Nahalnish, her senses attuned to a different reality. She ignored the medicine man's pronouncements, her focus absolute. She wasn't looking for a miracle. She was looking for the subtle signs she had fought for all night long. She saw what the others blinded by their grief and preconceptions did not. The shallow, ragged breathing of the previous night had been replaced by a slow, even rhythm, the rise and fall of his chest, deep and regular. The angry, blotchy crimson flush of the fever had receded from his face, leaving his skin a pale, natural color, now filmed with a fine sheen of sweat, a healing sweat, not a feverish one. She reached out her fingers, trembling slightly from exhaustion, and lightly touched his forehead. The skin was still hot, but the violent, searing heat that had felt like touching hot stone was gone. It was now merely the warmth of a lingering but broken fever. The battle had turned. As if roused by her touch, Nalnish stirred again. His eyelids fluttered a fragile, moth-like movement. He groaned, but this time it was not the sound of delirium. It was the sound of a body waking from a long, painful sleep. Then his eyes opened. They were no longer the wild, glassy, unfocused orbs of a mind lost in fever's grip. They were lucid, dazed and confused, but lucid. He blinked slowly against the new light flooding the hogan, his gaze moving sluggishly from the curved ceiling to the sleeping form of his mother, to the towering figure of his father, and finally to the small, exhausted girl kneeling beside him. His lips, chapped and dry, parted. A single word emerged, a dry, rasping whisper, but in the suffocating silence of the hogan, it sounded as loud as a thunderclap. "Water!" The word shattered the world. Hastin, who had been about to deliver his final damning verdict, stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. Hozo jerked awake, as if struck, her head snapping up. Her eyes clouded with sleep, and grief widened in disbelief as she saw her son looking at her. A sob. A sound of pure, unadulterated, impossible joy escaped her lips. Chief Hashke's stoic facade didn't just crumble, it disintegrated. He gasped a sharp, ragged intake of breath and took 2 stumbling steps to his son's side, falling to his knees, as if his legs could no longer support the sudden, violent release of a night's worth of torment. He grabbed his son's hand, holding it between both of his own. It was warm and damp, not burning. It was the hand of a living boy. "My son." He breathed the words thick with an emotion so profound it left him shaking. "Nalnish." Hastin was frozen in the doorway, a statue of stupefied disbelief. The triumphant sneer had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed, vacant expression. His gaze flickered from the conscious boy to the small girl, and to the humble clay pot of dark liquid sitting near the fire. His entire universe of powerful spirits, intricate ceremonies, and malevolent curses had just been utterly and completely defeated by a handful of bark and leaves. Seeing her work was not yet done, Dean gestured to the water skin. Hozo, now weeping openly with relief, scrambled to bring it. With a tenderness that belied her own exhaustion, Dean gently lifted the boy's head and shoulders as his father held the skin to his lips. Nalnish drank slowly at first, then more deeply, the simple act a more powerful testament to his recovery than any words. When the boy had taken his fill, he settled back onto the furs, his eyes closing not in delirium, but in a natural healing sleep. Hashki slowly rose to his full height, his movements stiff. He turned to face Dean. The look in his eyes was one of profound awe, of deep, soul-shaking respect. He saw her now, truly saw her not as an orphan or a child, but as a vessel of a powerful, forgotten knowledge. He walked over to where she knelt, his presence immense. "You spoke of a disease, not a curse," he said, his voice low and intense. "Show me. Show me the truth you saw." Danae, her voice still quiet, but now imbued with the unshakable authority of truth, gently moved the furs covering Nalnish's legs. She pointed to the small dark scab on his calf, still surrounded by a faint circle of inflamed skin. The sickness did not come from a spirit. She explained, her voice clear and steady. "It came from this, a tick from the mountains. It carries a poison in its bite. My grandmother taught me to look for the small door through which a great sickness can enter." Hashke knelt, his eyes tracing the insignificant mark, the almost invisible source of so much pain and fear. The truth was there, simple, physical, and undeniable. A truth that Hastine, in his arrogant quest for a grand invisible enemy, had been utterly and completely blind to. The chief then stood and turned his gaze to the doorway, where the medicine man still stood pale and trembling. The first full rays of the dawn now streamed past Hastine into the hogan, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the air like 1,000 tiny spirits. The golden light did not just signal a new day, it cast a harsh, unforgiving glare on the shadows of ignorance and pride. The truth had arrived with the dawn. The news of Nalnish's survival didn't just sweep through the camp, it fundamentally remade its reality. The terrifying, unknowable curse that had held them, paralyzed in its grip for days, evaporated in the morning light, replaced by the mundane, almost insulting simplicity of a tick bite. The camp's collective fear, a taut and brittle thing, shattered into a wave of relief, so profound it felt like a physical release, a great shared exhalation. Children who had been shushed into silence began to play again, their laughter tentative at first, then bold. The women at the looms spoke in animated tones, the rhythm of their work resuming its steady, comforting cadence. But beneath the joy, a deeper current of change was carving a new course through the bedrock of their community. All eyes turned to Danae. She was no longer the girl who existed in the spaces between conversations, the silent figure in the shadows. When she emerged from the chief's hogan, late that morning, blinking against the bright sun, the people parted for her. It wasn't a path cleared by fear, as it might have been for Hastine, but one cleared by a new and unfamiliar reverence. They looked at her small frame and saw the immense strength it contained. She had walked into the jaws of the chief's wrath and emerged not only alive, but victorious, armed with nothing but her grandmother's wisdom and a quiet courage no one knew she possessed. The most immediate and dramatic change was the fall of Hastine. His power, built on a foundation of mystery and ceremony, had been shown to be hollow. He had not just been wrong. His blinding pride had nearly cost the chief his son. He remained cloistered in his hogan all day, but his presence, or lack thereof, was a heavy weight on the camp. That evening, Chief Hashke, his face calm, but his eyes hard as flint, walked to the medicine man's dwelling and entered without ceremony. The conversation was short, its contents never shared, but when Hashke emerged, his expression was resolved. Minutes later, Hastine stepped out of his hogan for the last time. He carried a single water skin and a small pouch of food. He wore no ceremonial paint, no feathers, no symbols of his station. He was just a man stripped of his title and his mystique. Without a word to anyone, he walked past the silent onlookers, past the fire pits, and out into the vast, indifferent desert, a solitary figure swallowed by the twilight he had once claimed to command. His departure wasn't a punishment. It was an admission. The world of spirits he had so loudly proclaimed to understand had been defeated by a truth he had been too arrogant to see. Over the next week, Dean's world transformed. She personally oversaw Nalnish's recovery, a constant, quiet presence in the chief's hogan. She brewed the willowbark tea to manage the lingering fever, and created soothing salves for the fading rash. She instructed Hozo on preparing nourishing broths, her hands demonstrating the proper way to shred the dried meat and which wild greens to add for strength. She was no longer a peripheral figure, but a central one, her confidence growing with each successful task. Her true test came 3 days after Hastine's departure. Ken, the same elder woman who had so curtly dismissed her as a girl who plays with weeds, approached her, her face a mask of shame and fear. In her arms, she carried her small granddaughter, the child's face flushed with a familiar, feverish heat. Healer. Ken began the title, both an apology and a plea. My little one. She burns. She will not eat. Danae felt a flicker of the old fear, the tremor of inadequacy. But then she looked at the child, and her grandmother's teachings took over. Her hands were steady as she felt the girl's forehead. Her eyes were clear as she examined her throat. She recognized the signs of a simple summer fever, not the strangling fire that had taken hold of Nalnish. It is not the same sickness, Dine said, her voice reassuring. She led Ken to a small work area outside her aunt's hogan. We will make a tea of elderflower to make her sweat, and a cool compress from the river clay. She will be well. Ken watched, mesmerized, as Dean worked. There was no chanting, no rattling, no grand performance. There was only knowledge, skill, and a deep, abiding connection to the earth and its remedies. When Dene handed her the prepared tea and a small pot of cool clay, Ken's eyes filled with tears. I was a fool, the old woman whispered. My ears were full of thunder. I could not hear the truth. Dine simply nodded her forgiveness offered in the gentle act of healing. The wordless exchange was witnessed by others, and it cemented her place more firmly than any decree from the chief could have. Nalnish, meanwhile, was growing stronger each day. He would sit outside the hogan, wrapped in a blanket, watching Dene as she worked. One afternoon she brought him a cup of warm broth. He took it his hand, now steady, brushing against hers. I remember hearing your voice, he said, his own voice, still rough but clear. When I was in the fire, it was quiet. It was the only thing that made sense. He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a respect that bordered on awe. You were brave, braver than any hunter facing a bear. You faced my father. You faced Hastine. Thank you, Dane. She felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. She had saved the chief's son, and in doing so, had gained a friend, an equal. On the day Nalnish took his first unaided steps, Chief Hashke called a council. He stood before his people, his son beside him, leaning on him for support. He called for Dene to stand on his other side. For days we were lost in a darkness of our own making. Hashke began his voice, resonating with humility. We listened to the thunder of chants and were deaf to the whisper of truth. His eyes found Dean. We honor the warrior who protects us with the spear. But today, we honor a different kind of warrior. One who protects us with knowledge, whose courage is to see what others miss and to speak when others are silent. He gestured for the beautifully adorned medicine pouch of her grandmother. As he presented it to her, he said, "This belongs to you. You have not just earned it, you have reclaimed it. From this day forward, your voice will be heard in this camp. Your knowledge will be our shield. You are Dean the healer." As Dean accepted the bag, a lifetime of being overlooked fell away. Later that evening, as the celebration for Nalnish's recovery filled the air with music, Hashke approached her where she stood by the fire. "My father once told me about your grandmother," he said quietly, so only she could hear. He said her magic was that she paid attention. I was a boy when she healed a wound in my own leg that the medicine man then said was cursed. I had forgotten that lesson. He looked at her, his expression deeply earnest. "You have reminded us all that the greatest power is not in what we command the spirits to do, but in what we can learn from the earth by simply listening." Dene looked out at the faces of her people lit by the dancing flames. They were smiling, celebrating safe. Her silence had not been emptiness. It had been a space for listening, for observing, for understanding. Now she had a voice. It was not a shout that demanded to be heard, but a clear, calm tone that people leaned in to listen to. It was the voice of a new kind of power, a new kind of wisdom. It was a voice that would now be carried on the wind, a permanent and vital part of her people's story. The story of Dain is a powerful reminder that in the clamor of the world, true wisdom is often found in the silence. It teaches us that the greatest courage isn't always found on the battlefield, but in the quiet conviction to speak the truth even when no one else is willing to listen. Her story isn't just a tale of the Old West. It's a timeless lesson about the power of observation, the importance of questioning authority, and the incredible strength that can be found in the quietest voices among us. She saved a life by noticing what everyone else ignored, proving that sometimes the sharpest eye is more powerful than the sharpest sword. If this story of quiet courage and hidden strength resonated with you, please honor Dene's legacy by giving this video a thumbs up. Share it with a friend who appreciates tales where wisdom, not weapons, wins the day. And be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you won't miss another story that unearths the forgotten heroes of history. Thank you for listening.